Okay, 2 minutes. That will I have it 2:58, so I think in 2 minutes we'll be ready. We'll be sharp on time. Or do you have a different time zone?
It's okay. I'm فرق Sheikh Zayed.
Your watch is 2 minutes behind, Doctor.
على
مش
فكرة
كده؟
in Sheikh Zayed we are 2 minutes behind the azan. Okay, go ahead please, Shireen and Yasmin.
Yasmin, we're ready to go.
Okay, so I'll just give the welcome remarks on behalf of ERF. So, dear distinguished authors, panelists, partners, and participants, it's our pleasure to welcome you all to the webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on households and firms in the MENA region. As the pandemic spread in 2020, numerous questions about the socioeconomic impact arose everywhere. However, there was no accessible microdata on households and firms to answer these questions. So to fill this gap, ERF launched the ERF COVID MENA Monitor in 2020. The monitor is a series of wide-ranging nationally representative panel phone surveys targeting individuals with mobile phones aged 18 to 64, as well as micro enterprises. The survey is covering a number of Arab countries, namely Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Sudan, and Jordan. The series of bi-monthly short panel phone surveys took place in parallel in these countries, including multiple waves of interviews with the same respondents. This allows for what we hope would be an accurate assessment of changes over time in what was a rapidly developing crisis. The range of questions monitored the effect of the crisis on households, workers, as well as micro and small enterprises, and the way in which they were affected and how they were coping to deal with the pandemic. The effort was made possible by the intellectual leadership of the principal investigators, Dr. Rogia Assad, Dr. Mohammed Ali Marwani, and Carolyn Kraft, and the generous contribution of our partners, the International Labour Organization, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom, the World Bank, and the Arab Fund for Economic and Social Development for the data collection component. Now, once data was collected, it was made available for open access on the ERF data portal. And I take this opportunity to invite everyone to visit, check, and use the data. Now, while the data collection was one aspect, to take the first stab at the data in terms of analysis and start to conduct the research component, the ERF and the Agence Française de Développement set a research partnership. And in the context of this collaboration, a call for proposals was launched with a view to understand the consequences of the social and economic crisis generated by the pandemic. ERF received over 50 proposals, and the review process led to the acceptance of 6 proposals, which were developed into 6 papers and associated policy briefs. Moreover, the PI team prepared 4 policy briefs using the data to summarize the key findings, policy issues facing households, workers, farmers, household enterprises, caregivers, and firms. All this output is now available online for public access. Now, today, we are delighted to share with you the main findings and key messages from all this research work. Before concluding, I would like to thank the AFD for this fruitful partnership with the ERF, which we hope will continue to other endeavors. And I would also like to extend our appreciation to our PI's team. And because of their effort and dedication, I don't think we'd have been able to pull all of this off. So thank you very much. I would also like to express our sincere appreciation to our distinguished speakers, panelists, and participants who have joined us today. And thank you all, and looking forward to stimulating and engaging presentations and discussions. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. And first of all, I have to say that I'm very happy to find back the ERF and all its network and its friend. This network is being really at the foundation of putting together researcher, policymaker, and is been active for several decades. And I have the chance to have known him very little, very, very young, and I'm very happy to be with you today. So I really would like to thank the ERF for hosting the dissemination webinar stemming from a research partnership that follows several years of collaboration between the ERF and the AFD on the production of statistical data. and scientific evidence at the service of policy markers and development stakeholders in the country of the MENA region. This is really the marker of the ERF, and thank you so much. So as you said, Yasmin, since 2018, the IFD has been supporting the ERF in the production of key data like the labor market and panel survey initiative, as well as promoting the quality research produced by its network. The past collaboration show that reinforcing dialogue between academia and the policy world can bring fruitful knowledge from statistical production, as well as research being translated for practitioners and policymakers. And at the AFD, it's really important to be able to stem from what has been found in the field with original data to put together the recommendation. So in 2020, the call for paper has been given us the chance to mobilize in a critical moment the scientific community from the region to inspect some novel microdata and answer some pressing questions regarding the impact of COVID-19 on people's lives and firms' behavior at a moment where the MENA region was hit hard as every part of the world by this pandemic. And I would like to salute and thank the authors participating for this call for papers for their excellent work. I'll also extend my thanks to the coordinator of this program and Raghi Assad, Caroline Kraft, Mohamed Ali Marwani on the ERF side. And I would like also to thank Cecilia Poggi on the FD side that she coordinated this program. So this, the analysis presented today and tomorrow will shed light on the coping mechanism that have been taken in the short run to help national authorities as well as development actors like the AFD to support development activities for supporting countries during and in the aftermath of this tough time. And I hope it won't happen, but basically what has been found in those results could be taken as takeaway if by mischance the other crisis would happen. So I extend my thanks as well as all the researcher of the network involved in this work, and I wish everyone a good discussion today, and I'm looking forward to hear those fruitful exchanges. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Yasmin and Helene, for your introduction, and of course, thanks goes to the ERF for convening such a great panel. Shireen is always the engine behind the scene, assisting the whole organization, not only Ibrahim. I would like to welcome all the panelists, the discussant, and the attendees in general. Everybody is on time and everything is done right by the clock, so to speak. So I think Namatullah is a new member here, but she has done a wonderful job communicating with each member of this panel. So thank you all. I just wanted to make sure that we are all on the right panel here. I do that in my classes. So students who are coming to the class supposed to be in a different one, I always remind them that this is the right class. So I'm glad everybody here is for the impact of COVID-19 on household and firms in the MENA region. That's the name of this panel. I believe we have 3 speakers, or I'm sure, or 3 authors, Raghi Assad, Caroline Kraft, and Mohamed Ali Marwani. These are the 3 authors of this research paper, and our friend Khalid Abu Ismail is the discussant. I think I will do a brief intro for each of the participants. Professor Raghi Assad needs no introduction in this labor market panel. He is the professor of public affairs and public policy at the Humphrey School in Minnesota. He chaired the Master of Development Practice program, and he has been with ERF, I think, almost since the inception, 1994. And he is, of course, a lifetime research fellow. He was a member of the board of trustees of ERF for a long period. And he is currently a member of the BOT of the Arab Council for Social Science. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Labor Economics, the ISA in Germany. And his current research focus on labor market in the Arab world, with focus on youth and gender issue. I would like to specifically credit Raghi for basically reviving the interest in micro analysis data of the labor market by taking on his shoulder the issue of getting the data through the surveys, with a lot of cooperation with different agencies around. So his name is becoming synonymous with the labor market survey right now. Thank you, Raghi, for your effort. And we appreciate all what you have been doing in that area for the region. Dr. Carolina Kraft is an associate professor of economics at St. Catherine University. She received her master's degree in public policy from Minnesota, Humphrey School, her PhD from the Department of Applied Economics, again from Minnesota. Her research examined the issue in development economics, of course, labor, education, health inequality in the Middle East is becoming her focus. The current projects include work on refugees and labor market dynamics, life course transition, human capital accumulation, and fertility. Thanks for Carolina. I don't see her in here, but I know her work, and I know her extensive effort dealing with the Middle East. Our friend Muhammad Ali Marwani is now a resident representative of the Institute of Research for Development, the IRD in Tunisia. And he's an associate professor of economics at Paris 1, the Sorbonne. And he is the research fellow of the forum, member of the advisory group of the African Evidence Network, research fellow of the Migration Institute, research associate of the LEDA Dial at Paris University. His research focus on the interaction between structural change, skills demand, and productivity growth, and on the impact of migration in the MENA region. He is currently the principal investigator of various research initiatives that deals with the impact of COVID-19 and on the vulnerability of the firm to social distancing measures. Thank you, Mohammed, and we are all looking forward for your presentation. I think presentation is 20 minutes. The discussant will take 15, and the floor will take another 15 to end up on time. So the floor is yours, people. I think, Raghi, you might take the lead there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan, for this very generous introduction. And I'm going to share my screen now. So the presentation will be split between myself and Dr. Muhammad Ali Marwani, and Dr. Kraft will be available to answer questions. She'll take all the difficult questions later on. And so this is work that we have done. It's really not a research paper, but a summary of 4 policy briefs that we put together based on the data that we collected from the COVID MENA monitor. The COVID MENA monitor, I will explain in more detail later about the timing, etc. But as to start, we see considerably different experiences across the countries in the Middle East and North Africa with regard to the pandemic. They adopted different closure policies. They loosened and tightened the policies at different times. And they also had quite substantially different economic impacts in terms of the effects on GDP and on the economy in general, and as well adopted different policy responses. So we're going to try to highlight these differences as we go through, but in general, they were all quite affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, so the series, there are 4 policy briefs that have been issued over the period that we collected the data on. Some of them are focused on households and micro firms, and some of them are focused on firms in general, the micro, small, and medium enterprises, as small and medium enterprises were covered by a different set of surveys. So we are able to look at change over time across these various waves of the survey. So let me give you a sense first of the progression of the pandemic itself in the different countries. As you can see, Jordan was very strongly affected fairly early on in the fall of 2020, and then had a big resurgence again in the spring of 2020 with the number of cases. Tunisia was the second most highly affected country, and the strong impacts came also in the fall, but increased significantly late in 2021, in the summer and fall of 2021. And you can see that both on the number of cases and the number of deaths, which was really much higher in Tunisia towards the end of 2021. Morocco was much less affected. It had one big spike in the fall of 2020 and the winter, but then things quieted down. And as you can see, Egypt had a much milder experience with the pandemic, even though they're suspecting underreporting of cases in Egypt, but even the death rates, even if they're underreported by a certain percentage, they have been fairly mild relative to the other countries. Now, in terms of the policy response, the closures that were taking place, most countries adopted closure policies that were higher than the world average. This is a closure index which compares, the scale is from 0 to 100, and you can see that initially all countries adopted very high closure rates, even at the gray line being the world average. But then very quickly in May of 2020, both Tunisia and Jordan loosened up quite substantially. And that was the time where they received they started getting hit very hard by the pandemic. Whereas Egypt and Morocco loosened much more gradually and maintained a fairly consistent closure stand that remained, at least in Morocco, higher than the world average. In Egypt, by the end of 2020, it started becoming less than the world average and on a declining trend. So the inconsistent closure policies in Morocco and in Jordan and Tunisia is reflected to some extent in the spikes that they have seen. Now, moving on to the policy responses, social and economic policy responses, you had responses that target both households and firms. Number of countries took the existing social protection programs and expanded them significantly. So, for in the case of Egypt, the ration cards that are used to give food rations at subsidized prices were expanded. The Takaful and Karama cash transfer program was expanded, and so these were existing social protection programs that expanded both in terms of their coverage and the amount of money spent through them. But there were also new programs developed. Nearly all of the countries created new social protection programs for informal or irregular workers. To the extent that these could be identified, they were provided with cash transfers for a certain number of months, either early on in the early spring of the pandemic, but also in Egypt going through the end of 2020. Firms received primarily loans from the subsidized loans from the government. But overall, the social and economic policy responses were fairly limited. In Egypt, we're talking about 1.8% of GDP spent on these extra expenditures to address the COVID impact. In Jordan was the highest at 8%, Morocco 3%, Tunisia 2.3%, compared to a global average of 10.2%. So generally well below the global average for most countries when it came to policy response. In terms of the impact on the economy, you can see clearly from this graph, this is quarterly growth rates compared to a year earlier for the four countries. Morocco and Tunisia were affected much more strongly in the early parts of the pandemic in the second quarter of 2020. You can see this big decline in GDP, especially in Tunisia, but continuing large declines in the third and fourth quarters, whereas Egypt had much lower declines and eventual recovery. Of course, the big recovery you see in Morocco and Tunisia in quarter two of 2021 is compared to a year earlier, which had the very big decline. So of course you would have the reversal of these large declines. But Egypt managed a positive economic growth rate all through 2020. So on average, 2020 was positive. Jordan was a slightly negative growth rate for the year of 2020, whereas Morocco and Tunisia had very large negative declines of negative 7.7% for Morocco and 8% or more than 8% for Tunisia. So we're trying to capture what's happening to households and firms throughout this pandemic as we go through. So as you heard earlier, these COVID MENA monitor surveys were carried out in multiple waves, different timing in different countries. In Egypt, there were 2 waves in February and June of 2021. In Jordan, there were 3 waves, February, June, and August of 2021. Morocco and Tunisia, there were 4 waves. The first one is in November 2020, and then February, April, and June of 2021. And Sudan, 2 waves in April and August of 2021. So when you look at the data, just remember that the timing of the waves was different. The Morocco and Tunisia had the earliest waves, as well as going all the way through June, whereas in Sudan, Jordan and Sudan had later waves. We may not be reporting in these policy briefs on all the waves, but we'll try to capture as much of that change until at least June 2021 as possible. The panels had 2,000 individuals in each country. And then there were refresher samples to deal with attrition. Phone surveys are well known for relatively high attrition rates. And we did our best to try and follow people over time. We're giving incentives to participate. But of course, there were a relatively high attrition. And the enterprise surveys, which Muhammad Ali will talk about present the results in more details, were covering the quarter 1, 2, and 3 of 2021. Now the micro enterprises are covered together with the household surveys. So we captured the micro with the household surveys, whereas the small and medium are captured in the specialized enterprise surveys, and the samples were 500 in each round, primarily obtained from the yellow pages, randomly selected from the yellow pages in a stratified sample. And the data, of course, is publicly available through ERF. So let me give you a little bit of a sense of the results on households. And this is going to be just a taste, so you can go back and read the policy briefs. We can see that for the employment aggregates, the labor force participation, employment, and also unemployment, there was quite a significant recovery over time. You see that the participation rates are increasing almost everywhere compared to November 2020, or at least compared to the first wave that we collect data on. The only exception is Morocco, where there was a bit of a decline in June of 2021, but we attribute that to cyclicality in the agricultural agrarian economy of Morocco, which seems to explain that downturn. Tunisia, you see a bit of a downturn in employment rates among males, but you see an increase in employment, significant increase in employment among females, which result in an overall increase between April and June of 2021. but generally the picture is of recovery in the employment aggregates. If we look at the how different types of workers were affected specifically, so first we look here at wage workers and how they were, how workers with different starting positions, the type of wage work we looked at includes the public sector, the formal private sector, informal private sector. We divide into in and out of establishments because out of establishments tend to be much more vulnerable. These are the people who work on a casual basis, not tied to a particular fixed establishment. You can see that consistently across all countries, the informal workers out of establishment are more negatively affected, and that negative effect is particularly pronounced in February 2021, but still until June of 2021, you see quite a significant negative effect. So for example, in Egypt, the effect actually is increasing for informal private outside establishment between February and June of 2021. But the public sector workers were much less affected. And you can see very few of them were affected in any negative way. Formal private was the second least affected, and then the informal private wage workers were the most affected in all countries, but less so in Tunisia and Egypt in terms of, less so in Tunisia in terms of, and Morocco in terms of earnings, but quite a bit in terms of layoffs. As far as the other types of workers we looked at are farmers and then self-employed workers, which will be looked at as part of micro enterprises later. Farmers were, again, affected negatively. They had a decrease in family days worked, in access to, in the use of seeds and inputs, and in the harvest. But then you can see that for Morocco, for example, there's a big decrease in June compared to February, and this is the cyclicality in the agricultural economy of Morocco that you see. There is a lot less in terms of labor input and seeds input in June, but you can see that in terms of harvest, there is a bit of an improvement in the situation in harvest in Morocco. In Tunisia, it's a little bit more consistent over the two periods. And in Egypt, there is also a somewhat slight worsening in inputs, the use of inputs, and a slight improvement in harvest between February and June. So, but these are clearly affected also by drought and other factors besides COVID-19. Now, in terms of household income, and this is really the bottom line for households, we find that income did not recover significantly between February and June. So still by June of 2021, compared to February 2020, significant proportion of households had a decrease in income of more than 25%. We're talking about 46% of households in Morocco, 29% in Jordan, and then 23% in both Egypt and Tunisia. These are households that were strongly affected still as late as June of 2021. Now, you also notice that there is a bigger effect generally for the low-income households compared to high income. These are the quartiles of income pre-pandemic. So we try to organize households in income quartiles pre-pandemic, and the first quartile is generally more strongly affected than the second, third, and fourth. And you can see that there is therefore increase in inequality resulting from the pandemic because of the lower income households being affected more. And that's the general pattern you see in all of the countries. Now, in terms of government assistance, you find that there was, for instance, we exclude from this, by the way, access to ration cards in Egypt, because almost 75% or 80% of households pre-pandemic were receiving those. And so there was a bit of an increase in access to assistance through ration cards, but we don't include that in those statistics specifically. But in other countries, you see that that Jordan managed to reach a much larger portion of its households with significantly good targeting, that you can see that the first income quartile is receiving significantly more assistance than the fourth. And you can see that efficiency in targeting is observed in most countries, especially later in the pandemic. In June, for example, in Morocco, the upper income households, second, third, and fourth quartile are not receiving very much. And there is pretty good targeting in Tunisia as well. In Egypt, however, there was good targeting early on in February, but then as time went on, the targeting became less efficient, and you have much more of the assistance was going to the higher income households. Let me now, I'll switch it off to Muhammad Ali. Do you want me
to have 5 minutes only? Yeah?
Okay, sorry, Muhammad Ali, but we might steal some time from Khaled. So, Muhammad Ali, you want to share your own screen?
Yeah, I can do this.
Okay, well, I'll stop sharing.
Okay. So, do you see it well now?
Yeah, if you can maximize. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So, thank you, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the ERF team. Thanks for AFD and other donors. And of course, thanks for my co-authors and PI. So what we see for firms here, we have micro.
Can you switch your screen? Can you switch your presenter's screen with the other screen, please?
Ah, okay.
Yeah, great.
Is this good now or still?
Yeah,
now
that's perfect.
That's perfect.
Now it's fine.
So, but yeah, this is the slide. So here we look at the operation status for firms, and we see that the firms that are open with normal hours increase with size in most countries. So we see that it's mainly the micro that have been the most affected. We see it very clearly for Jordan, for Tunisia. Then we look at in revenues, and of course, accommodation and food, as everyone knows, has lost a lot. But we find also in other sectors that we have also big decreases, like construction, and in some cases, manufacturing and agriculture. So we have the big losses, and then we have other losses as well. The main issues were access to customers, mainly at the beginning, then slowly loss in demand became more and more important. And in some countries like Tunisia and Egypt, the access of inputs. And actually the issue of the access of inputs became a problem everywhere in the world, not only in the region, but it's something that we find very important in the survey. About the help, or government help, so we see that most firms didn't ask for or received any help. In some countries, it's 65%. In Tunisia, the lowest, it's 50%. Half SMEs didn't ask for or applied or got support. And if we look for micro enterprises, which are not here on the figure, it's 25% for Tunisia. So micro is every time is worse because I think they have less links with the government. They don't think they will get the support, and a lot of them are informal, so they don't apply for this assistance. So the conclusion of household, maybe I will, we won't do it because Raghi said it already. It's just to summarize, given that time is very short. I will maybe focus more on the firms part. So the most important challenge, as we said, is the loss in demand, followed by access to customers and input availability. And we have, which I already said that almost half in Tunisia and 2/3 in Morocco of SMEs didn't receive any support. So, so we have a struggle in both cases, households and firms, and particularly for informal workers. And in informal, in micro enterprises where most of people are informal. And I think what would be interesting to look at, this is not in the slide, but I was thinking about it when listening to Raghi about the high rate of support in some countries and the lower in some others. is to try to compare if the countries that put, let's say 8% and the others that put 3%, if there is a real difference today in terms of evolution of the economy. So how effective, I think this can be a kind of follow-up of the current work, if some researchers are interested, it's trying to see if the policies that have been implemented of support have been effective in terms of reducing poverty in the long run, and in terms of economic, like, for example, did we lose a lot of firms? What happened? Did the countries that supported more, for example, got a better economic growth in 2021 or 2022? Many questions that can be raised to I think, to continue the current work. So, and thank you. I tried to be very quick, so I squeezed some things, but.
Thank you, Muhammad, very much. I appreciate your sticking to the time. We're going to give my friend Khalid Abu Ismail right away. Khalid is the senior economist at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission, the ESCWA. And I think everybody is familiar with Khalid's work on poverty, inequality, and human development. He is the author of more than 50 technical papers and UN flagship publication. Khalid actually has been an advisor for a long period of time at the United Nations Program, Regional Office for Arab State in Cairo and Beirut. He held various research positions with the Egyptian government as well, the Center for Decision Support. And he is also work as an assistant to the Minister of Public Enterprise. He is a policy affiliate at the ERF, and he is a guest lecturer of the Faculty of Economics in the Lebanese American University. Khalid is most well-known authority now on equality and poverty in the area. We appreciate his work. Khalid, you have 10 to 15 minutes, so we can economize.
Thank you, Hassan. Much appreciated for the kind introduction. Just a quick correction. I am formally with the Lebanese American University. I will try to be very brief, but before I start, just two congratulations are in order. One, to ERF for having this COVID MENA monitor. The phone surveys are extremely important, especially when we know that surveys are not really being regularly updated. And of course, congratulations are in order to Raghi, Caroline, Mohammed for the excellent work that they have done. I'll try to focus more on the regional narrative, big picture, extending comments to 22 countries, not just the 4. And I'll try to be very brief because really, I think as Raghi and Mohammed laid it out, I mean, the big issue here is that you have improvements in the labor force participation rates on the growth side, but these have not really resonated with a household. So again, I think the one point I'd like to pick on is why is it that we're seeing at the national level is not trickling down to households. That's one issue I'd like to focus on. The other issue is the differential impacts that we have among different segments of the labor market, you know, the formal and public sector, private sector workers having different outcomes than the informal ones, and of course, the richer households and the poor ones. So these are basically going to be my discussion remarks. So I'd like to start with what I call the Arab growth predicament and summarize in 2 stylized facts. One, growth, even at the national level, and this is private consumption expenditure, has been pretty low. Look at the dashed line for the Arab region compared to other regions, it has been pretty low. And this is growth in private consumption expenditure, which, as we know, is the biggest component of GDP, but the narrative is still different than GDP. So even the projected rates for that are slightly lower than the GDP. Nonetheless, it has been low. Okay, so Arab growth, even without going to per capita, has not been stellar by any means, especially compared to other developing regions. But, and this is a very big but, even with this low growth, if you were to predict using whatever models you want, parametric, non-parametric, do whatever you want. Okay. If you were to predict how much of this growth at the national level goes down to the households, it's less than 20% to 30%, depending on which model you use. And that's hugely problematic. And that's the lowest worldwide. Okay, so even when you control for income level, you control for whatever you want, it's low, okay? And that has huge implications. Now, of course, the question has been why. One reason which we all know, the stylized factor, simply aren't that many jobs. We have the highest unemployment rates, especially between youth and females. We also have pretty low labor force participation rates. I think Raghi has dwelled on this point significantly in the past. If you go to the ILO ESCO report, we also shed light, zoomed in on the formal private sector. And what we tried to say is that even when your employment elasticities have been high at the national level, because jobs were being created, most of them are being created, as we all know, low value added, informal sector. You zoom in on the formal sector, private sector, formal manufacturing, and your elasticities are horrible. Okay, they're really low. Okay, so you're not creating decent jobs in the formal private sector. Now, when the formal public sector as well, the public sector isn't generating jobs, that basically means that your two formal sectors of the economy, the ones that are decent supposedly, are not generating enough jobs. That has huge ramifications on everything, including, of course, poverty and inequality. Let me just focus on some of these ramifications. So you want to look at the growth story, which is not bad. And then you want to look at what's happening at poverty using projections. This is our expected trajectory for extreme poverty, growth rates increasing from around 12% all the way to 14%, and with an additional around 8.5 million people falling into extreme poverty. This is region-wide for all of the region. As I said, I'll focus on that level. Same thing with national poverty lines, national poverty rates. They've been rising despite this growth. Now, here you also have the comparison with the base case scenario, which is the pre-COVID scenario. So the difference between the two figures will yield around maybe 25 million, okay? And an additional 17 million that are expected to fall into poverty. But if you were to compare with the pre-COVID scenario, that figure would also rise to about 25 million extra people falling into poverty according to national poverty lines. That's pretty huge, and it brings the total estimated number of poor people according to national poverty lines to around 125 million or so. Even in the case of Egypt, which has had the best growth record, you still have this increase in poverty projected. Okay, so this is our estimate, this is not the official estimate. And even after poverty was declining from 2017 to 2019, we see an expected a potential rise in poverty precisely because of the fact of the low pass-through, okay? If you don't assume the low pass-through, if you assume what happens at the national level is what happens at the household level, then this figure will not be there, most probably in the case of Egypt. So again, consistent with what you found, inequality increasing, when you look at the work that's been led by Vladimir, who's also with us on this call, you'll see that there's been a huge impact on wealth inequality. We don't know precisely what happened on the income side, but we expect it to be of the same order of magnitude, but that's just on wealth. So look at these figures, okay? The median person saw a decline in 28% in their wealth, okay? At the same time that you've had the top 1% making a gain from, let me just go down here, and from 75% to 81%, and the top decile from the top 1%, yes, the top 1% from 35 to 40%, and top decile from 75 to 81%. This is huge, and this has actually been the highest increase in wealth inequality worldwide. So now we're actually approaching the global average on wealth inequality. So our Ginies are now approaching the global average, and with the typical stylized fact that we are significantly lower in terms of wealth inequality is not resonating with the facts anymore. So the conclusion is, and I hope that I'm still within the time limit, that what you see at the household level and this increase in poverty is really the result of deteriorating incomes and rising inequalities. We don't know yet what's happened to the Ginies, the household Ginies, but if you look at the wealth side of the story and what we know about the projected pathway of income poverty, you expect that there will be a significant poverty impact. And this is again consistent with the findings, I think, of Raghi, Caroline. It's also consistent with two very different stories. One, which is a resilient returns on capital and rent or more resilient, especially for the, which are, you know, the incomes of the wealthiest, so versus the vulnerability of labor income. And of course, these are the incomes, the vast majority of incomes of the vulnerable workers. It's something which I think people like Piketty have highlighted. And I think this differential story would lead us back to the bigger picture, and particularly the political implications and the political economy ramifications. And again, the discussion is how do you change this structural feature of Arab economies? How do you move away from rentier, low value added, vulnerable economies that are very highly affected by these shocks to ones that are more resilient, diversified, and more developmental in nature? Of course, this is a bigger question that I'd like to end with, but I have two questions here, I think, for Raghi, Mohammed, and Caroline. First, more mundane question. I'm not sure how you assess the targeting part. Okay, so when you said that you know, Jordan had better targeting than Egypt, it wasn't clear to me how that assessment was made. And the other big question, huge question for me, is labor force participation rates increasing at this rate in such a short period of time? That's huge. And I'm not sure why. Maybe people, when they get poorer, they start having no choice but to get back to work. The employment responses, I was surprised. Again, these are phone surveys, and I know the limitations of the surveys, but I thought the order of magnitude of these responses on the labor force side, where we have to stop and explain why. So I'll stop here. Again, congratulations for ERF and for the writers for wonderful work, and look forward to you know, continuing reading this sort of stuff coming out from you all. All the best.
Thank you very much, Khaled. As usual, you raised a lot of very important issues, and you added more to the puzzle that we have. So I'm going to give Raghi, if you would like to give your feedback, maybe 2 minutes before moving to the floor, just to give your impression. Yes.
Okay, and maybe Carolyn and Dali want to jump in as well. But quickly on the targeting, it's basically looking at the gradient of the households that are receiving assistance by income level. So if I can go back here, let me see if I can share my screen again here. So basically, if you look at this curve here, you have the proportion of households receiving assistance in the first quartile being much higher than in the fourth quartile in the case of Jordan. So that's where we're saying there is more efficient targeting. They seem to be reach poorer households more. Whereas in Egypt, you look at June 2021, the gradient is very weak, right? 9, 15, 9, and then it goes up to 15% of households in the fourth quartile receiving assistance. So there's not much targeting happening in the case of Egypt in June 2021. There is better targeting happening in February 2021. This is really the point we're making, is that gradient from the first to the fourth quartile. Now, the other question you had to do with the participation rates and how come they are recovering so much. The recovery is not all that big. I mean, we're talking about 70 at the height of the pandemic, 78% participation, and it's because a lot of marginal groups, the labor market, women and youth in particular, tend to quit searching for work. They don't have work, and they quit searching for work when the job market is really poor. They come back to search for work when the job market improves. And so participation here there is the state of the job market does affect participation, and that's why we see a response upward. It's not just a supply side effect, but it's affected by the demand side as well. And I'll stop here and see if others have something to add.
Thank you, Raghi.
Just one word, maybe. I think Khaled focusing on the pass-through is really interesting, because we've seen this while doing these policy briefs that very often we see very big differences in growth between countries. And then when we look at the detailed data on labor, on household, on income, we see that there is not these differences. So it's very strange. Even in some cases, we found that in Morocco, it's more than in Tunisia, the loss in income, while growth was better in Morocco. So it's really important, I think, to focus on this. And this is my only point.
Thank you, Mohammed.
And
Caroline?
I'll just add one point in terms of the labor force recovery is this is seen in official statistics too. We went and looked at the quarterly employment rates in these countries in another paper, not in these policy briefs. And you do see this dip with COVID, but then pretty much a recovery relatively soon after the pandemic. So it's not just in the phone surveys and the official statistics as well.
All right, thank you, Caroline. We do have a couple of questions from the floor. I think our friend in Santanali was asking, is it possible to use external data, meaning excess deaths a la economics, to scrutinize the available deaths and by inference the case data? And then there's another question from Amal Kurti. She asked if the report only cover 4 countries. I understand from what Carolina also posted on the chat that there is another country, Sudan, is going to be presented tomorrow. So if anybody on the floor would like to ask, please raise your hand or write on the chat. Just as an info, Khaled mentioned that there is an ESCWA paper coming out soon about the pass-through, which is a very important question. I'm going to add my own observation. I noticed the major difference between Egypt and the rest of the country and the growth rate, the first stage there of the corona. And I think there are different numbers between the one given by the author and the one given by Khaled. Just wonder if you guys are measuring the same, is it the real exchange rate or the nominal one? This is also added up to Muhammad Ali question there. I'm gonna let you answer.
Are you talking about growth or exchange rates?
Growth rate.
Dr. Hassan, growth rates.
Growth rate. Okay, so please go ahead, Ragi et al, Muhammad and Caroline.
I mean, I can go ahead and answer a little bit about the growth rate question. So we were looking at quarterly growth rates compared to the same quarter the year before primarily, and they were in real terms. But for example, for Egypt's fiscal year is different. It ends in the middle of the calendar year. So it depends on, I don't remember exactly which Khaled was using, whether we were comparing fiscal year or calendar year as well as quarterly, what we were talking about.
You said it wasn't the real one, right? Okay.
Yes, real growth rates, yep, constant prices.
Okay. Muhammad and Ragi, if you want to answer the Insantanali question.
I'm sorry, my internet got cut off a little bit, so I didn't hear Insan's question.
Okay, it's on the chat, and Insan is asking about these external data. And I think Carolina, you answered it probably, so maybe you can go ahead.
Yeah, the question was just about case data and deaths. And so there already is case and death data from a number of publicly available sources. Those are, of course, the official reported ones. Excess mortality data is much harder to come by in the countries we're looking at. That would definitely be an interesting research question going forward. But our world data, for example, or the World Health Organization have a lot of case count, like daily or weekly case count and vaccination and deaths data that we use in the policy briefs.
But
Okay,
the recent report from, yeah, if I can just add to this, the recent report from the WHO on underreporting of deaths showed that Egypt, the underreporting rate is 12 to 1. So Egypt is highly underreported in terms of excess death, the methodology that the ILO uses. However, even if you multiply by 12, the numbers are still going to be lower than what you saw in Jordan.
Well, living in Egypt, Ragi, I can tell you that it's not 12, it's multiple of 12. At one point of time, I think we passed the threshold of 50% infection. This is just from our casual living in the country. So my belief that we got the herd immunity very, very fast and very quickly, and that's probably why we were not hurt as the rest of the world at that time. There's a question, Mahmoud Haddad, how the decrease in the firm's labor market impacted the equity market. I'm not sure I understand that, Mahmoud, but I'm putting it to the panel.
I can elaborate on that.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if labor market decline, firms' profitability decline, that's what some companies claim. And at the meantime, I've seen in some countries that the equity market continue to increase. I don't know if there's any correlation between like profitability in these countries and the stock market. What I mean by the equity market is the stock market in Jordan, stock market in Egypt. Have it impacted in the same manner? Because that's a very good implication for investors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mahmoud. Another one from Insan, where did the 4 countries fare in the closure in a sense of saving people versus keeping the economy going choice? So as our friend Larian mentioned, this by Corona or this by famine in a sense. How did they balance that? That's the question of Tanali.
Sure, I can sort of start with these questions, and then definitely Raghi and Ali can add. I think you see definitely some differences in the sort of lives versus livelihoods trade-off, as it's often referred to. For example, Egypt tended to be less strict. Most other countries in the region tended to be stricter than the world average. And you see that playing out sort of in terms of, for example, growth rates in Morocco and Tunisia. So, they're trade-offs, right? They made different policy choices. And then in terms of the firms and the equity market, so the firm data we were looking at is for micro, small, and medium enterprises. So these are not like listed stock market listed firms. So I wouldn't necessarily generalize from what happened in the sort of small and micro space to what happened on the stock market in terms of equities, because they're very different segments of the economy. But I don't know what other people want to add on that.
Yeah, if I can contribute, I think some studies in the world show that some countries did at the same time better on both economy and that it was not necessarily always a trade-off. And in the region, we see it. For example, Jordan was doing better on lives and the economy than Morocco or Tunisia. But also we have to take into account the differences between the countries. For example, the economies of Tunisia and Morocco are much more open, much more dependent on tourism. So maybe it's easier than in Egypt, where you have less exchanges with outside, maybe less people traveling. So there are plenty of aspects and also the dynamic side. Sometimes you close like Morocco did, and then you can open more because you closed more before. So it's really a very complex issue. It's very difficult to give just a point on this, but it's clearly one of the most interesting points in this pandemic.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think it's important.
Yeah, but can I
go ahead.
Yeah,
only 1 minute. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the general impression is that Egypt was somewhat more moderate than the other countries in terms of its as strict. So even though there may have been policies on the books, they were less stringently implemented. And so there was as usual in Egypt, you kind of have loose implementation. Now, Tunisia and Jordan had very strong, especially Jordan, very strict closure policies early on for the first 2 months, and they couldn't sustain them, and they definitely had to loosen them significantly. And that contributed to the huge increase in cases that they saw later on. So partly there was unsustainable levels of closure in Tunisia and Jordan very early on in the pandemic that created inability to sustain those closure policies.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We needed to end on the hour sharp. It is 4 o'clock now. Thank you for the panelists, the 3 of them, and thank you for our discussant, Khalid, and the ERF team. Thank you as usual, and I think they are ready to go for the next session. So again, gratitude to everybody who organized, helped, and assisted in this. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All the best.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our speakers and lead commentator. And I think we're ready to move to our session 2. Dr. Hela, if you're ready, we are ready. I think we have our speakers and our lead commentators all on panel.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Shireen, and thank you for the ERF for inviting me and for always leading very interesting data collection activities and always keen on implementing research and impairing it with the policy aspects. In this session, we will be having 2 papers. The first paper is on women, youth, and labor market outcomes during COVID-19, evidence from Egypt and Jordan. The 2 speakers and the authors of this paper are Dr. Vladimir Halasny, so I hope I am saying his name correctly, who is an economist or an economic affairs officer with the Poverty and Inequality Research Team at ESQA in Beirut. Prior to him joining the ESQA, he served for 13 years as an associate professor of economics at Iwaha Women's. It's a university in Seoul. There is a lot of problematic things to pronounce, Vladimir, in your short bio.
I'm trying.
He presently conducts research in labor and welfare economics, particularly in relation to Asia and the Middle East. He holds his PhD in economics from Michigan State University. Actually, Vladimir has very interesting and very different hobbies where he likes gardening and beekeeping. So we look forward not just to your interesting research, but also to tasting your honey, actually. The second author of the paper is Dr. Shireen El-Azawi, she is a lecturer in the economics department at Levy School of Business in Santa Clara University in USA, and a labor economist at UNDP Regional Bureau for Arab States. Shireen is a research fellow also with the ERF, and her research focuses on poverty and inequality, labor economics, and international trade, with a special emphasis on the MENA region. She holds also a PhD in economics from the University of California and has a master's degree from Stanford University. Without further ado, Vladimir and Shireen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hala. I hope you can all hear me. And now let me try to share my screen. Here we go. Are we good? And I will increase the size. Please jump in anytime if something is unclear or if you have questions. Feel free to either put questions in the chat box or just shout them out directly. So now I will struggle a little bit with the little Zoom tabs, but okay, let me, here we go. It's important that I see my own slides and I can start talking. So I will try to give a short presentation of the current status of this project. Unfortunately, Shireen was not able to join us because of the time difference and other commitments, and so it's up to me to do the presentation. And of course, all the shortcomings in this version of the work are they're Shireen's, and so you can address those to Shireen directly. I'm saying that this is ongoing work because as I will show in a few minutes, the results are not as clear as we would have expected when we started this project. We expected clear effects of COVID from beginning to the end of the epidemic. We expected clear effects on females and on youths, but the results are mixed, and like Ragi was saying, the results vary very much across countries, across sectors, and I think so we need some more iterations to disaggregate the data correctly to see any of the expected results. Okay, and I will go over. So when I'm saying that this is ongoing project, I will also talk a little bit about what has been tried and why we think that there were issues and where the project is currently going. Okay, so the first question: why are we focusing mostly on youths and on women? It's the stylized fact about the precarious and poor working conditions or poor labor market conditions that women and youths face in the market. And so the working hypothesis was that these groups entered COVID already disadvantaged, and perhaps their labor market outcomes became even more worse off because of the effects of COVID. And again, as we will see, there are some mixed results across different models, and about the level of disadvantage before the onset of the epidemic and through different stages of the epidemic. Okay. Ragi has already covered a lot of this ground, what has been happening in the region and how the governments have responded, and what we should expect to see in the labor market outcomes of different groups of workers. To measure this stringency of or the weight of the epidemic, we use the Covid-19 stringency index developed by or tracked by the Oxford Covid-19 government response tracker at the University of Oxford. And this graph summarizes what Ragi has been describing, that it has not been a smooth experience over time, and the experiences vary vastly across the countries covered by the data set, the ERF COVID-19 MENA monitor. In this presentation, I will focus on two countries, Jordan and Egypt, which are similar to each other in terms of the timing of the survey waves. And this graph shows that the two countries had different trends in terms of the stringency of government responses to the epidemic. we see that even though the trend is similar, the levels and kind of the tempo, the speed at which the stringency was increasing or decreasing are different between the two countries. So we should expect different effects on workers' labor market outcomes between the two countries. Okay. The source of data is clear. Raghi has talked about this. And just one note here is that when we use these data sets, we have to keep in mind in the back of our heads some of the limitations of these data sets. So the relatively small sample sizes, the possibility of non-randomness or selection issues into the sample, and the types of workers that are covered by these phone surveys, which affect the results we can produce with these data sets. We use two probabilistic models. The main model used in our work is the multinomial logit regressions of workers' employment status. It's kind of a static dependent variable where we, on the left-hand side of the model, we have whether the worker is currently employed, unemployed, seeking employment, or out of the labor force. Alternatively, we have tried to disaggregate employment statuses more into formal, informal, irregular, self-employment, unpaid family worker, and so on. But here we had some problems getting sufficient sample sizes in each of these cells of workers. So I will mostly focus on models just distinguishing employed, unemployed, and out of the labor force. And I will show a little bit of the results of simple logistic regressions where we study the probability of workers being temporarily or permanently laid off. There's a separate question in the surveys. So here I can just point out that actually there are several relevant questions in the surveys asked, and they don't line up to each other one-to-one. And that's why we get somewhat different results, whether we are using the main reported current employment status of the workers, or whether we are using the question, were you in the past 60 days laid off from your job? And so I will jump to the main results for Egypt and then for Jordan. And so this is where the project is currently. And the results are kind of weak, as we will see, that we don't see a very clear effect of the stringency of the government COVID responses, or of the status of workers as youth, non-youth, or even between genders. But and we don't see too much significance. So the first worry is about the sign of the coefficients. Many of them are in the expected direction. So we take that as evidence that COVID did have a bad effect on the employment outcomes of workers, and the outcomes on youths were greater than on non-youths. But we cannot put too much confidence in these results because of non-significance of individual coefficients. So here we show in the first block of coefficients, it's the multinomial logit of employment status for men. We said that the stringency of the COVID response in Egypt had a negative effect on workers, male workers' employment outcome, being employed. Positive effect on the probability of being out of the labor force. When we interact youth with stringency, we see that being youth, so youth workers suffered more under the stringent government response to COVID, because here the coefficient is negative, and the effect on the probability of being out of the labor force is positive. For men, we see mixed or unexpected results, so that the stringency of COVID response had a positive effect on the probability of being employed, but also positive effect on being out of the labor force. So the coefficients between the three employment statuses are not consistently related to each other, a bit of a mix and match. And but for female youths, we have the consistent set of results that, again, female youths suffered more under COVID regulatory stringency, and the effect on the probability of being out of the labor force was positive. In the model, in the simple logit model of workers' probability of getting laid off over the past month or two, we see unexpected results for men, and so again, mix and a match of results. It appears that the more stringent the government response to COVID is associated with a decrease in the probability that male workers would be laid off, but a positive effect on the probability of youth workers being laid off, and vice versa for women. And the other important set of results in these regression models is so these models controlled for workers pre-existing conditions, their status as of February 2020, and there we see a lot of significance and a lot of the expected signs, which just emphasizes how time persistent workers' employment statuses are, and how rare actually it is for workers to change their employment status. That it's a relatively rare event for workers to be to switch from being employed to unemployed or vice versa. And so once we control for this pre-existing status or for fixed effects, a lot of other results wash out, and we don't see them. In Jordan, similarly, similar results show up with the same kind of mixed bag and insignificant results. So the stringency of COVID response has an unexpected is unexpectedly positively associated with the probability of being employed among men, but also positively related with the probability of being out of the labor force. Being youth, so youth workers appear to be more affected by stringent government response than non-youths. Among women, we see more of the expected results, so that the stringency of government response has the expected effect on women's employment outcomes. So negative effect on the probability of being employed, positive effect on being out of the labor force, particularly for youth, for young women. The final set of results that I will show is again the simple logit regression of the probability of
Vladimir, you have 2 minutes to go, so I don't know if you want to move to the conclusion directly, or you have 2 minutes to use them as you wish.
Sure, sounds good. So here again we see the expected effect that this more stringent government response to COVID was the higher the probability, no, the unexpected result. Here we have negative coefficients. So it appears that when the government responses were most stringent, workers had the lowest probability of being laid off. But for youth, we do find the expected effect that youths were more likely to be laid off during most stringent times. And once again, we find the high time persistence of workers' employment outcomes, which are really driving the values of the dependent variables. So I think these regression results just emphasize how challenging the data set is, and how challenging of a dependent variable we're using, the employment status, because of the nature of the data, and because of the time persistence, which over the span of, let's say, 1 or 1.5 years doesn't change much, and it's hard to study changes in employment status over such a short period of time. Okay, just quickly, instead of looking at individual marginal effects of covariates, if we calculate the predicted probabilities of being employed, being unemployed, here I'm showing the probabilities of becoming employed among workers who are presently non-employed, we see some trends over time and differences across groups of workers. The challenge here is because we have used lagged dependent variable, we can only report time trends from the first wave to the last wave of the survey. So so here for Egypt, we have from June 2020 to August 2021. We don't see the most critical period during COVID, which was the first 6 months between March 2020 and something like June 2020. Okay, in sum, we can conclude that in Jordan, male youths are less likely to be employed, while in Egypt, we only see it in the initial period in June 2020. Female youth started worse off than non-youths, but pulled ahead of non-youths by summer 2021. Similar results for probability of losing employment among presently employed workers. In both countries, we can conclude that male youths are more likely to lose employment than non-youths. For females, it is true only before summer 2021. So we can see that the different lines for the 4 different groups have a slightly different trends and slightly different levels, but honestly, the differences are not significant. So we have to be very careful interpreting these results. I will jump to just one additional specification. So I mentioned that, well, the big problem here is that this survey started taking place in the middle of 2020 or in the fall of 2020, when the main effect of COVID has already finished. If we had data on the first 6 months of the epidemic, perhaps we would see more results in terms of level and also in terms of trends. So for that, instead of controlling for lagged dependent variable and controlling for pre-COVID employment status, we use wave 0, the recall question from the survey, as an additional survey wave. So we kind of artificially increased sample size to go back to February 2020. And instead of controlling for pre-existing employment status, we have tried to use fixed effects where there are huge statistical challenges. And here I'm just showing some of the tentative results of this estimation. So the good thing is that now, under this alternative model, we can extend the time trend going all the way to February 2020. And here we see very interesting results that the probability of employment status of being employed went down significantly from February 2020 to wave 1, such as spring 2021, and then started improving again. So the last message I will say now is that it is really important to account for the initial 6 months of the epidemic to see some of the results. Essentially, in this in the ERF COVID-19 MENA monitor, we can't really study the weight of the epidemic. We only study the recovery from the worst point in the epidemic. And we really need to take into account the status in February 2020 to see the scale that's between wave 0 and wave 1. There has been significant deterioration in employment conditions. And since summer 2020 or fall 2020, whenever the first wave of the survey was, we see recovery, and we can focus on the so it's important when we talk about how different groups of workers were faring, to distinguish how they were faring during the period when the economic situation were getting worse and when the economic situations were improving. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. Now I'll give the floor to the discussant, our one and only Dr. Rashara Ramadan, which is an associate professor at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at Cairo University with a PhD in economics from Toulouse School of Economics. Since 2010, she worked as an economic consultant for different international organizations such as the UNDP and ESQA and alike. She's also a fellow of the summer program in social science at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. Her research interest includes applied microeconometrics on poverty, food security, gender, and human development in developing countries. Dr. Rashad, the floor is yours. I will give you only 5 minutes because Vladimir spilled over 5 minutes on your time. Please, okay. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Hala. Vladimir, would you please stop sharing your screen so I can share mine? Because I cannot share. Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you again, Dr. Hala, for the introduction. And let me first start by thanking Dr. Raghi and congratulating him and his team for this rich data. As usual, ERF is our main source of rich data where we can work on different topics and discuss during such interesting webinars. And I would like to thank ERF for inviting me to discuss these 2 interesting papers. So this first paper, I will not go into details, but as you saw from Vladimir's presentation, it's mainly trying to see the employment prospects by gender and by age groups based on the different waves of of the MENA COVID-19 monitor data. And as Vladimir said, as it is work in progress, so I would just like to share some ideas that may help in continue this progress and finalize the paper. So the first thing, as you said, it's important to compare with wave 0 and what was the situation before the spread of the coronavirus. So I think it would be interesting to show the situation of the labor market and the different characteristics of different individuals based on their employment status in February 2020 before the spread of the pandemic in the 2 countries. Also, I think you focus on change by employment status, but I believe sectors are really important given that, as we all know, some sectors had been negatively affected, like tourism and other service sectors and agricultural, as Dr. Raghi presented. So I think it would be interesting to add the change in employment status by sectors and how the different sectors had been affected. I was just surprised why you focus mainly on the probability of being laid off, while there are other questions in the survey that can allow us to understand the situation or the change in situation of individuals, like reduction of wage or reduction in working hours, which also will affect the income and inequality situation and the employment outcomes. So I didn't see what is the motivation behind focusing only on this change in the situation and not tackling the other outcomes. For the stringency index, it was kind of not clear for me. So I think you presented with more discussion in the presentation. So I would highly recommend you to add more discussion on it in the paper. Also, I didn't see what is the rationale behind the idea that the youth will be more affected by such measures. Is it related to their already employment status in February 2020, or given their age? It was not clear for me, especially that in several regressions, it was not really significant, the interaction between the youth and the stringency measure. And also the impact of this index on the probability of being laid off for men and women is also not clear for me, because sometimes the signs are completely the opposite and sometimes significant and others not, based on the country. So I think this requires more discussion and investigation why it does not include the same impacts for both men and women. You focused on gender and age groups, but again, I don't know what is the motivation behind, why not trying to, I mean, we agree that women and youth are more likely to be vulnerable in the labor market before and after the spread of COVID-19, but what about also individuals living in rural areas, I know there's no disability, but I mean other vulnerable groups that can be affected by the pandemic. And my last question, which was not really clear in the paper, but you discussed it in more details in the presentation, is the propensity to transition to different employment status during the whole period of the different waves. I think also this requires more investigation and explanation of, I mean, for some lines, for instance, male, non-youth, sometimes the probability increase or decrease, and from one wave to another with not clear explanation why this happened or why it changed over this different months. But again, thank you for this huge work and this interesting work. And Dr. Hala, the floor is back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rasha, for abiding to the time. Vladimir, do you really have a burning response, or can we move to the other paper and then get back to the discussion?
We can move. It's no burning need.
Oh. Great. So the second paper that we will be listening to is on social safety nets and food insecurity in MENA in the time of COVID-19. It's a collaborative work with several authors, but it's Dr. Amira El-Shel who's going to give us the presentation. She is a senior policy manager at JPAL in MENA, where she leads policy partnership for evidence generation, dissemination, and use in social protection sector. She is also an assistant professor of economics at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at Cairo University. She holds her PhD from City, from the University of London, and a master's from UCL. Her current research focuses on social protection and public health interventions, behavior change during disease outbreaks. Amira, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes, please.
Thank you, Professor Hala. Okay, let me try to share my screen. Okay. So can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much. My name is Amira El-Shel. I'm very happy to be among you here today. to discuss with you our recent work on social safety nets and food insecurity during COVID-19 in MENA. And I would like first to extend sincere thanks to the ERF for convening these events, and also for AFD for the funding. I would also like to thank our reviewers and the honorable attendees for being there for us and for advising us on how to strengthen our work. Let me start with our motivation. Why did we choose this topic at the beginning? Frankly speaking, we came across very worrying figures from the region on food insecurity. We know that in the MENA region, a little less than 30% of the population suffers from moderate and severe food insecurity. And frankly speaking, what worried us more, not the prevalence rates, but the factors affecting food security in the region. And I can see this from the chart on right of my slide. This is like an index. It's called the food security score, and it translates the vulnerability to food security in different regions. And here you can see that it's like a heat map. So basically, when it comes to Sudan and Yemen, Syria, they are have like high vulnerability to food security. In Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Jordan, we have a relatively lower but still high compared to other countries worldwide. So what worried us is not just the prevalence of moderate and severe food insecurity in the region, but also the high vulnerability that a lot of MENA countries have when it comes to food security. And these two charts basically reflects the situation before the pandemic. After the pandemic, we know that the number of people in MENA in a food insecurity crisis increased from 29 million in 7 countries in 2020 to about 32 million in 2021 due to COVID-19. We also know that about 52 million people in MENA were chronically undernourished in 2019, so basically before even the onset of the pandemic. So these were the figures that triggered us to pursue this study, and also so we decided to delve into what's or like how can we describe the food insecurity situation during COVID-19, and we were even more worried because we knew that the crisis in developing countries in general and in MENA countries in particular is demand rather than supply driven. So we know that we don't have an issue when it comes to the supply of like food supplies, but the issue is the purchasing power of populations in MENA. Probably this is the situation before the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. So this would probably change in light of the repercussions of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. But at this stage, if we are focusing on the COVID-19 situation, we can say that the crisis is demand rather than supply driven. We have also seen from the recent studies after the onset of the pandemic, we know that about 50% of MENA households reported that their incomes have decreased post the pandemic. We also know that a lot of them, or like a considerable proportion of MENA households suffered from higher unemployment rates amid the COVID-19 pandemic. We also know that this situation can be kind of mitigated when like in under the umbrella of social safety nets. We know that social safety nets can play a critical role in mitigating the negative repercussions of pandemics or like of shocks in general. But recent studies indicated that social protection measures reached only a small fraction of the population in most MENA countries. So basically, these were like, we can say that this was the dark picture that triggered us to pursue this study. So we started our research by surveying the literature to see what do we know so far and what we do not know. So we know that overall social safety nets have positive effects on food insecurity in various regions, ranging from sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, South and Southeast Asia, and MENA. But all the studies indicated, or like generally indicated, a positive effect of social safety nets on food security or food insecurity. But these studies were in a non-shock context. So these were our initial investigations of the literature. We didn't find micro evidence on the social safety net food insecurity relationship in MENA. We came across a new stream of literature relating COVID-19 to food insecurity, and we know that lockdown policies negatively affected food security. We were, from our side, we were more interested in the purchasing power story or hypothesis of food insecurity in the context of COVID-19. And finally, we knew that there is a gap in the literature on the social safety net food insecurity relationship in times of crises in general and in times of COVID-19 in particular. So our study has 4 main objectives. The first one is to estimate the effects of social safety net benefits, of receiving social safety net benefits on household food insecurity during COVID-19 in MENA. The second objective is to compare between the effects of receiving social safety net benefits from the government versus non-governmental sources, the effects on food insecurity. Our third objective is to examine if social safety nets have managed to mitigate the vulnerability of some subpopulations to food insecurity as the COVID-19 situation developed. And finally, our fourth objective is to investigate whether social safety nets mitigated the food insecurity effect on COVID-19 coping strategies by preventing households or by preventing individuals from adopting adverse coping strategies, because we know that depleting assets or selling assets during a crisis would likely have negative effects on development outcomes in the middle and long runs. So these are our 4 main objectives, and we were lucky to access the ERF's COVID-19 MENA Monitor Household Survey data. At the time we conducted the study, we used all the data available. We had 2 waves for Egypt, 2 waves for Jordan, 4 waves for Morocco and Tunisia. We know that now we have more waves, but at that time, these were the only waves available. But it's important to emphasize that we only used individuals who were interviewed in at least 2 waves. So we wanted to preserve the fixed effect component of our econometric analysis. So we only used individuals who were interviewed in at least 2 waves. And that's why our working sample size consists, or our working sample consists of about 6,500 individuals, and our time framework spans from November 2020 to June 2021. So moving to the variables, or the main variables we have based our analysis on, our main dependent variable is food security or food insecurity, and we used 3 measures or 3 indicators to estimate or to measure the food insecurity situation within a household. The first one is the inability to buy usual food amount due to price increases. The second indicator is the inability to buy usual food amount due to decreased income. And finally, a general indicator, or a holistic measure of food security, indicating whether there had been food changes or changes in food consumption within a household. Our main treatment, our main explanatory variable is our treatment, which is receiving social safety net benefits, either from the government or from non-governmental organizations. And here it's important to highlight that we only, as treatment, we only use non-usual support from the government rather than using usual support. So we used non-usual support either from the government or from other non-governmental organizations, NGOs, because when we explore the data on usual support, like for example in Egypt, Takaful and Karama, we didn't find switches on and off. So we couldn't basically define receiving usual support as a treatment in our case. And basically it's included in the fixed effects component of our estimations. We also included other explanatory variables covering a range of demographic, social, economic indicators, and these are the time varying characteristics we could find in the data and include in our analysis. Okay, moving to our empirical strategy. So we used a generalized differential fixed effects model to provide answers to all our research questions. To estimate the effects of social safety net benefits on food insecurity during COVID-19 and to compare between the effects of support received from the government versus from non-governmental sources, we estimated this conditional fixed effects logistic regression. And here our main dependent variable is the food security measure, and we ran the estimations 3 times for each of our measures. And here our main explanatory variables are social safety net benefits, or the receipt of social safety net benefits from any governmental source. And our second treatment is the receipt of social safety net benefits from non-governmental organizations. And here the Z is our vector of time varying characteristics. We also included components or try to control for fixed effects and wave or time effects. For our third objective, or our third research question, whether social safety nets mitigated the vulnerability of some subpopulations to food insecurity, we also had the food security indicators, our 3 food security indicators, as our dependent variables. But here you can find that we interacted vulnerability with the receipt of social safety net benefits. And here vulnerability is a vector of demographic and socioeconomic characteristics that typically make individuals more susceptible to food insecurity. So you can think of it as, let's say, gender, which is the determinant of the utilization component of household food insecurity. You can think of it as being unemployed, which is a determinant of the accessibility or component of food insecurity, etc. On our 4th research question, here which is whether social safety nets mitigated the food insecurity effect on COVID-19 coping strategies. You can see here that our dependent variable changed. It's the adoption of or resorting to a coping strategy, and we used 3 coping strategies as indicators. The first one is taking money out of savings. The second one, which is the most worrying when it comes to long-term development outcomes, is selling assets. And the third indicator, or the third measure of coping strategies, is resorting to any coping strategies at all. It can be taking money out of savings, it can be selling assets, it can be taking money or borrowing money from a bank, borrowing money from relatives, etc. And here we, as our independent variables or explanatory variables, we are interacting food security. So here food security is appearing on the right-hand side of the equation. We are interacting food security with the receipt of social safety net benefits to estimate or to provide answers to our 4th research questions.
Amira, minutes?
Sorry, how many minutes?
2.
Oh, okay. So this is challenging. Okay, I'll try to be as quick as possible. So basically, our data set shows that 40% of the respondents from Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco reported being food insecure in the second wave due to purchasing power reasons. Tunisia had the highest percentage of respondents reporting being food insecure, hitting at least 74% of its sample. And we know that in all 4 countries, more than 68% of respondents reported experiencing changes in food consumption in general. Here you can see from the figure plotting the changes in food insecurity that the food insecurity situation is more or less persisting. And in the 4 MENA countries, we can observe some like improvements in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, but like the trends for Morocco and Jordan can be described as worrying as per the COVID-19 MENA monitor household survey data. So let me jump to the results to save time. So this is our the table of our main results. So in this table, we present or plot the marginal effects of the receipt of social safety net benefits in the aftermath of COVID-19 on the incidence of food insecurity, and we report the results separately for each of the 4 countries. And we also present the estimated effects of receiving support from 2 sources, government and non-governmental organizations. So let me just highlight the main findings. So here we can find that receiving benefits from the government in Tunisia was led to a 15% decline in the likelihood of reporting being food insecure. And we only observe a positive effect of government social safety net benefits in Tunisia. So we don't, so the effects of the government in Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco is insignificant. So this is our main takeaway. The second takeaway is that we generally observe that receiving receiving benefits from non-governmental social safety nets reduced or significantly reduced the incidence or the likelihood of reporting being food insecure, both in Jordan, as you can see here. So this is 50% decline in the likelihood, and also in Morocco. For Egypt, we do not observe any effects, whether due to government social safety net benefits or non-government social safety net benefits. Maybe we can skip this one. Okay, so let's focus on the final 2 tables. The first one, or like this table, indicates whether receiving benefits from government social safety nets helped control resorting to negative coping strategies, and you can think of it as selling your assets, something like that. And these are the results from our pooled sample. So we can say that yes, receiving social safety net benefits from the government managed to reduce the likelihood of resorting to a negative coping strategy like selling assets, which is very critical in the case of low and middle income countries. And can also see from here that food insecurity, being an explanatory variable, is a significant predictor of resorting to negative coping strategies in general. So we tried to explain discuss our findings on the effectiveness of government support in Tunisia only, and these are like open for discussion, and we are looking forward to hearing from you, or like to hear your thoughts on this. So why is it that only in Tunisia we can observe a positive effect of social safety net benefits from the government on food insecurity? So it can be that in Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco, there were already in place social safety or social assistance measures that were in place prior to COVID-19. And we have this, for example, in the case of Egypt, when it comes to ration cards and when it comes to Takaful and Karama. So all of these projects were already in operation. And we are trying econometrically to see how can we estimate the effects of these usual benefits versus the shock responsive ones. Also, it could be the targeting mechanisms that have been adopted by the Tunisian government. So more or less they were more effective. Explaining our other result on the effectiveness of non-governmental social safety nets in Jordan and Morocco. This is actually justifiable or expected from our side, because we know that informal social support from religious and charitable institutions in MENA is culturally rooted. And we also know that usually non-governmental social safety nets are more efficient in targeting beneficiaries. They are typically more able than the government to reach households in need. So this is basically our conclusions. It's more or less the unusual government support was effective in Tunisia. We observed no effects of non-usual government support in Egypt, Jordan, or Morocco. And we observed that non-usual support from NGOs was effective in Morocco and Jordan. And we finally report that government social safety nets have mitigated the negative effect of food insecurity on resorting to adverse coping strategies. And I can stop here and be very happy to hear your
Thank you very much, Amira. Back to our lead commentator, Rasha.
Thank you, Dr. Hala. So first, thank you, Amira, Iman, Nada, and Yasmin for this interesting paper. And in fact, I was as concerned as you, because food security is my main research area since my PhD. And several months ago, I had your same concern, and I had been working with the same data, discussing vulnerability to food insecurity, but I focused mainly on Egypt. And hopefully my paper will come out soon, so I would be able to share it with you. And I believe we'll have a lot of discussion regarding this interesting topic, especially that, as you mentioned, Amira, it was a concern because it was mainly demand-driven because of the pandemic. But I think now we'll also have supply-driven problems with the Russia-Ukraine war and its impact on, especially with supply for Egypt. So as you mentioned, the paper answers 4 questions, which I think it's a lot, and I would highly recommend to focus on only 1 or 2 questions, because I don't think all the results answers all these questions. So I highly recommend to focus on 1 or 2. And as I said to Vladimir, so take my discussion as a way to work on progress on the paper and finalize it. So the first thing you discussed indigeneity that may exist between receiving social safety nets and food insecurity, and you discussed this, that it may not be related to self-selection, given that governments mainly provide social safety nets through a database that were already existing before the pandemic, so we don't have the self-selection problem. But here I had 2 concerns about this. First, that this will be the case mainly for government social safety nets, not for the non-governmental social safety nets. So still we may have the problem of indigeneity. And the other thing that even if the database exists before the pandemic, most of individuals benefiting of these programs are poor. And as we know, and as I can confirm for the case of Egypt, poverty and food security are highly correlated. So still, I am not sure that just assuming that providing social safety nets were based on database prepared before the spread of the pandemic, this can explain or solve the issue of indigeneity. The second thing, as you mentioned, you compared between formal or social safety net provided by government versus social safety net provided by non-governments. And here I have also several concerns regarding this differentiation between both. So the first thing that, as you mentioned, all these countries have already programs that had been implemented before COVID-19 and had been playing significant role in ensuring food security for a lot of individuals. If I will talk about the example of Egypt, in Egypt, I think around 80% of the population, if not more, have the ration card and benefit from the food subsidy system that for years, especially during periods of crisis, play a significant role in reducing vulnerability to food insecurity. So I think talk about only the non-usual without at least provide a description of the existing situation and what are the programs implemented maybe this is the main reason why you didn't find any significant impact on in Egypt for the non-usual formal or informal social safety nets. So I think it's really important to discuss it in more details, provide an overview of or mapping the social programs existing in all countries, because this may affect the situation with COVID-19. The other thing, that aggregating all types of programs in one package, like formal or versus informal, I think we all agree, and from the literature, is not really the same impact. Receiving food is not like receiving cash, especially if I have cash, but I cannot really access the food or access items because of the lockdown or whatever measures applied. So I think differentiating between the different programs is important, especially that I know from the survey that there are detailed questions regarding if you are receiving cash or food and what type of programs you are benefiting from. The other concern I have, especially that from your results and your conclusion, that informal is more efficient, and that NGOs or religious institutions or individuals can access or can target more efficiently the vulnerable groups or the food insecure. This is a huge concern from policy perspective. This means that these huge social policy programs implemented in these countries with all their burden, with the limited fiscal space, with all the actual crisis with the supply of food, this means that they are not significant or they're not efficient. And this is really concerning, especially that if we only will focus on informal, that as you know, the literature is not able to agree on its importance or its amount, and it's mainly depending on being able to, or being in areas with specific religion institution or special NGO. So this raises concerns about how we can face or how we can protect these vulnerable individuals, especially in terms in periods of crisis. The other thing, you compare or you try to explain the significance of social safety nets in Tunisia by the fact that they depend more on vertical expansion by adding more programs or increasing the actual programs to what was applied in Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco by expanding horizontally and increasing the coverage. I'm not sure if this is the main explanation or this the only way to explain why it's only significant in Tunisia, especially that if because of the actual situation or the pandemic, we have more individuals that had been not covered by the existing programs and governments decide to expand the coverage, I would expect this would have positive impact on food security and protect the vulnerable groups, especially that, as we know, some individuals who have not been considered as vulnerable or poor or food insecure, for instance, those working in tourism sector or in any other service sector that had been hard hit by the pandemic. With this pandemic, they will need to be expanded or covered by the other programs. So I'm not sure that horizontal expansion is not really significant in protecting the individuals. The last comment is regarding the gender dimension of your analysis. So I completely agree with you that gender is important, especially in the utilization of or the utilization dimension of food security, mainly if the woman is the one who is the head of the household or the one who is responsible for preparing food. However, as far as I understand from the survey, gender, and Dr. Raghi may correct for me, gender is the gender of the respondent. We are not sure if she is the head or not. So if she just answers that her household had to reduce their food consumption or were not able to access food, we are not sure that she is the head or she is the one taking decisions concerning food and she is the one responsible for the utilization dimension. So I would really be caution when I talk about this dimension. The other thing that I agree that is puzzling result is that the non-usual support from governments seem to have increased probability of women being food insecure, and I think this needs to be further explored. You try to explain by several points, and I think we would all agree, especially that we have the expert of labor, Dr. Raghi, and on gender. I don't think women will be more reluctant to look for jobs if they are receiving non-work financial aid. On the opposite, they may, because they are participating, they have lower participation in the labor market, as you mentioned, because of gender inequality and social norms, they will be more likely they are in need of receiving such aid. So I'm not really sure that your suggested explanation can explain this puzzling result, especially again that you mentioned the unequal distribution of nutrition inside the household, and we are not really sure this female responded to what is her position really within the household. And again, the last thing, focusing on the idea that non-governmental institutions are more efficient in targeting women or targeting vulnerable population. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe this is the case, but I would be more concerned that with all this huge budget spent on the formal social protection by governmental institutions is not efficient at all, especially in protecting those who we consider as vulnerable to food insecurity. And that's it. I would like to thank you again for this interesting paper and looking forward to more discussion for this interesting topic close to my heart. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rasha, for this very rigorous comment and discussion. We do have a question from the floor raised by Amal Karaki to Vladimir and Amira. Vladimir has already answered, but Amira then Amal is asking about the case of Jordan. Were you able to assess the impact on the refugee residing in the country? How does it compare to nationals? I give you, Amira, 2 minutes and 2 minutes only to answer or reflect on all the questions you have.
Okay, so let me invest 30 seconds in answering. So basically, we had the location of the households, either they are located in rural, urban, or camps. So these are basically the refugees. So we included them in our pooled sample, and we included a dummy variable for being there, like for the location, but we didn't calculate the specific or estimate the specific effects of receiving benefits on the refugees community in particular. They are included in the analysis, but we didn't kind of have separate results for them. On the reflections, so thank you so much, Dr. Rasha, for the extensive comments, and these are like basically our concerns, and in the discussion we tried to bring about what we think. So basically, 2 main points that are very that we are eager to explore here. So the first thing is the impact of usual or like non-shock responsive support from the governments in Egypt, Morocco, and Jordan, because basically these were massive social protection programs that were implemented pre-COVID. They were, the problem is that they are in the fixed effects components of our model, so we cannot separate them. When we didn't observe that they switch on and off in our analysis, so that's why it was very hard to, so they are in the model, but they are not, we cannot, as if we are putting them on the whole, we cannot separate their effects versus the shock responsive measures, unfortunately. But maybe like if these data limitations are kind of loosened, we can try to focus on this. And I totally agree on your point when it comes to indigeneity from non-government, like when it comes to the treatment from the non-government. And that's why if you are going to take this analysis further, we will just focus on government support, and we will try to control for the income level or something like that, because these are time varying characteristics that we can possibly include in our model. So we will just limit our analysis to the government support for the indigeneity concerns. We totally share them with you. The final thing is on the fiscal space and the limitations, or like the insignificance of the support from the government. Basically, the government, even when it comes to Takaful and Karama, they are implementing and I was just like having this discussion with Her Excellency Nabina Qabash, they are having these interventions jointly implemented by the NGOs. So the NGOs are implementing the large problems. So Takaful and Karama, part of it can be, for example, funded by World Bank or UNICEF, and they are implemented by the NGOs. So the model that I envision is a collaboration between the government and the NGOs. The NGOs have their edge when it comes to outreach, when it comes to delivery and targeting, and also the government has also like the upper hand or the holistic approach. So my model, or like the most efficient model I can see, is a collaboration, which is actually in place, I think, in Egypt. But I'm very happy to take this discussion further, and thank you so much for all the comments. And then I would like to receive them and like discuss them further with you. Thank you.
For sure, Dr. Rasha will be sharing them with you. I'll give the floor back to Vladimir for 2 minutes, but really 2 minutes this time, Vladimir, because we are already overshooting. If in case you want to give us 2 words of wisdom or something.
Actually, I don't have to say anything. Rasha's points are very valid. So I would have to see the bullet points again, one by one. But yes, we acknowledge that the results are generally weak. Why are we focusing on women and youths? Well, as these groups are interesting of their own, and also they're kind of symbols of vulnerable groups from before COVID. And we know from other world regions, there's some literature on who are the first out of the labor market in times of crises, who are the last in times of recovery. And so this is what we try to estimate here. And we soon realized that we cannot focus on the beginning of the crisis because the data were not being collected yet. So we switched attention to the recovery from COVID. Why not selected sectors? So we haven't done that. We should. That would be a very important disaggregation. I think the biggest issue is how we define employment outcomes. I think we haven't found an employment outcome that we would be happy with. I think this employed, unemployed, out of the labor force misses a lot of the transitions to vulnerable, gig jobs, in restaurants, and we don't know which sectors. So we haven't done the sectoral analysis. But if we disaggregate employment outcomes more, formal, informal, and so on, there we get into the issue of small sample sizes or mismeasurement. And so this is something that we are actively working on. Most recently, we worked on the trying fixed effects models, like the last presenter mentioned. And I think we have some breakthroughs there that things can be estimated. And we do find some results from February 2020 to the first wave of COVID. So anyway, it's very much work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. And just I wanted to allude that Dr. Rogi has made a very interesting remark in the chats, just in case people did not see it, that 80% of the series. Do you want to do it, Dr. Rogi, or should I do it on your behalf? Do you want?
Sure. I mean, I just was reacting to what Amira was saying, that she was looking at camps, rural and urban, but in fact, most of the refugees in Jordan don't live in camps. And we did make sure that we collected information on the citizenship and on the refugee status. And we even oversampled Syrian refugees in the Jordanian case. So there should be enough Syrian refugees in the sample to be able to do a separate analysis of refugees.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rogi, for this reflection, which I think is very useful. Well, we are long overdue. We are sorry to all the attendees that has been dropping because we overshooted our time. I would like to thank the presenters, the authors, and the lead commentator and the ERF for this very interesting webinar, and looking forward for tomorrow's webinar, inshallah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.